So where do we begin in diagnosing a landscape? This is an important training tool, one that you don't have 10 or 15 years to learn as you begin to do this work. But if you follow this process, I think it becomes very easy. I call the differences the macro view of a landscape and then the micro view. The macro view is sort of looking at the big picture from a higher perspective. The micro view is when you start getting into the details. So the first thing on the macro side is, what are the tree species you have? If you don't have a good tree ID book, they're readily available at most bookstores. But you need to know what you're looking at, because not all problems attack all tree species. If you don't know what the tree species is, you can't narrow down what could be attacking it. As an example, emerald ash borer only attacks ash trees. If you've got something feeding on a tree and it's not an ash tree, it's not an emerald ash borer. It sort of eliminates the need for you to worry about those things. Knowing the tree species will narrow down the list of causative agents by eliminating either pest or site factors which do not generally impact that species. And there's the extent of the problem. Is it confined to a single tree? Is it multiple trees on one site, or is it one tree species on one site? This helps us to understand better what the problem might be. Is it visible on adjacent properties or on nearby properties that you visited? This can help us figure out whether it's a site problem or it's widespread, and it could mean something more. It could be excessive water or drought, grade change, planting depth, herbicide injury, excessive shade or sun on that one property. Or if it's in a much more plentiful condition across the community, then it could really be something that's far broader in its impact and something you need to be aware of that's not unique to that property. But this can very rapidly narrow down the list of culprits just by knowing tree species and the extent of the problem. Then let's look at patterns. Nature seldom exhibits problems in clear, geometric, or linear patterns. You know, when you lay a tarp on the turf and you end up with a square brown spot, you know pretty well no insect or disease did that. It's the same with trees. In a set of dissimilar trees or shrubs, are they affected? Are multiple trees being affected? Is the turf brown in an area as well? Could it be construction damage, an herbicide, a gas leak, or pool water being drained that's creating all of these problems? Was there a recent change on the property? Can you still see it? I went to a property once that had a gas pipeline run right next to a tree, cutting off an entire half of the tree's root system. It took me a while to diagnose it, and we'll talk about how I did that soon, but it had happened 10 years earlier. Customer had completely forgotten about it, but it took the tree 10 years to start declining, and it was a beautiful tree before that happened. Look for patterns that don't fit the randomness of nature. Sometimes trees, shrubs, and turf will be all affected, and that can tell us an awful lot about what may be taking place in the soil. What's the history of the property? Knowing what happened in the area may give you clues. Were there floods, droughts, storms, saltwater inundation? Was there wind damage? Trees decline from these events, and they can surface much later. Knowing what might have taken place, as you should, because it's your territory, should help you to get a good clue. People in Texas are going to see a significant amount of tree damage as a result of what took place there this winter. Knowing all of that can help us a year, 2 or 3 years from now if you get a call. So how do we figure out how soon or how long it's been going on? Because speed of decline is pretty important in diagnosing whether you've got a long-term problem or a short one, something that's just suddenly started happening or something that's been progressing for quite some time. My experience has been that homeowners don't notice a tree that's declining until it's quite a ways along. And they'll tell you it just started looking this way. So what we're going to do is we're going to encourage you guys to use trees where you can see and touch the branches as the visual timekeeper. You can actually measure internodal growth. And what you need to understand about trees is that many times trees will put on an end bud at the end of the growing season. And that's where you see where the picture that shows bud scales, that's the end bud. And when those leaf scales fall off every year, they leave bud scars. And you can see the bud scars on that tree, on that branch example. You can measure the growth between bud scars to tell you how much that tree grew this year. And in many trees that have been declining for a while, what you'll see is you'll actually see those internodal growths getting shorter and shorter and shorter over time. On those trees that I described for you where the pipe was run past the root system, I went back 10 years and I said, something happened 10 years ago. This tree's been declining for 10 years. And that's when the customer remembered that they put a gas line in about a decade ago. Measuring that growth can determine how long the tree's been declining, often quite accurately. And this can tell you, do I have a sudden onset problem that might be something unique, that could be urgent matter, or is this something that's been ongoing for a very long time? Here's another example of that. If we look at how long this tree's been declining and you count the bud scars, you can see we've got about 7 years worth on that branch of growth in about a 6-inch period. And it's getting worse and worse. And this tells us that this tree has been declining for quite some time. Something serious is going on. What is it? What could it possibly be? We need to figure that out. But this helps us to know how long it's been taking place. Then we start getting into the micro stuff. And I show you that little 10x loop because that's one of the best things you could ever buy yourself to help you ID things. If you don't own one, I'd encourage you to get one. But first, you need to summarize what you've learned so far. And that big picture stuff that will help us to know what species are affected. If more than one, are they the same? Is the problem seen in other properties? So you can figure out, is this a problem with that property, or is this something that's a bigger issue that I need to deal with? You might be able to decide now that you have the culprit for the plant decline in mind, even if you can't find the clear signs of symptoms or insects or disease damage. So that's when we start to look at the micro issues that can impact a property specifically. You have to understand how site-specific problems can cause plant decline. It's absolutely critical for you to realize that 29 to 41% of plant decline has got nothing to do with insects and diseases. So what are some of these key abiotic, non-insect or disease-related issues? First one I want to talk about is grade change. If you look at the picture on the upper left, that tree's got piles of soil built around it. Depending upon how long they stay there, that tree is going to decline. In fact, as little as 6 inches of soil on an existing root system will cause that tree to decline and potentially die. Why? Because there is a specific level of air in the root zone that is necessary, and moisture in the root zone that is necessary. The tree roots can't survive if they are buried under soil. The next one I want to talk about is girdling roots. You can see that in the top right. It's a big issue for container-grown trees. So something that got taken out of a container before it was put in will often continue encircling the tree until it grows big enough to cut off the tree's vascular tissue, which is right beneath the bark. And you'll sometimes notice that by a flattened trunk on one side, or you might actually see the roots themselves, or you might see canopy dieback along that side. And it might require you to do a little digging right beneath the surface to discover those roots. This one is so obvious you can't miss it. Then you've got excessive moisture or drought. Both can kill roots. And you can end up with staghorning at the top of the tree. So you look at a tree and you see the branches at the top dead. You may see leaves that look like this, or you may see standing water. All of those things are things you can sort out. I'm sure all of you own a soil probe today. Soil probe is wonderful for figuring out deeper whether you have soil conditions that are anaerobic, without air. And typically you'll smell that smell like you're at the ocean, at a salt marsh. It'll smell sulfurous, and that kills the roots. And that's something you can never tell just by looking at the surface, but going in a few inches is very quickly able to be determined. I've been to sites where I've stuck my soil probe in and had water coming off of the soil probe as I pulled it out, telling me an awful lot about what I needed to know about root decline. Then you get chemical injuries. Herbicides can impact trees far from the intended target weeds. Now, most of our weed controls are safe enough to use fairly close to weeds. When you start getting into those that are more volatile, it's generally recommended you avoid weeds under trees that have leaves on them. Fertilizer can also burn the roots. And it's not just the fertilizer you might put on a lawn. Oftentimes people throw fertilizer under their trees. Fertilizer is a desiccator. It will actually pull water out of the roots and will kill them by desiccation. Not to mention the household and pool chemicals must also be considered. Again, you're a bit of a detective here, but these are the things you can figure out. And then winter injury, depending upon where you are in the country and whether there's snow or no snow, or whether it's normal or not normal to have winter injury, ice and prolonged cold without snow cover, high winds, snow load, de-icers. It can take years for your plants to recover. Understanding what may be going on can help you. And what I've discovered is that we often see plants for sale at the big box stores that are actually a full zone or more out of the range that they should be in. And people that buy them and plant them on their properties may discover that in a cold winter, that tree can't do well. That tree can't survive well. In this case, on the bottom right-hand side, it's a blue Atlas cedar, an absolutely gorgeous tree. But in really cold winters, blue Atlas cedars don't do well unless you're in zone 6 and higher. So you get into a zone 5, it'll survive 9 out of 10 years. And in that 10th year, it'll look like hell. All the needles may turn brown. It sucks all the energy out of the tree needing to refoliate. And you've got a tree that's now susceptible to borer attack because it's in a weakened condition. What other key abiotic factors do we face? Planting depth. This tree on the top left-hand side was actually planted that deep. And again, frequently planted too deep. They're done to stabilize the tree. People do that so they don't have to stake, or the tree's not got a strong enough root ball. It kills the root, it limits the moisture, and it can take years for a plant to decline. Sometimes just digging down around a tree like that will show you that there are no roots within any close proximity of the soil. Then there's construction damage. You're experiencing this already on new construction sites everywhere. You get soil compaction, you get roots crushed, especially the trees that they've decided to leave, which end up dying anyhow. They make you feel warm and fuzzy, but the trees end up declining and the customer has to take them down. Utility trenching, I mentioned that as well, because that's a critical one that's often overlooked. Improper pruning. On the middle left-hand side, this is not exactly what I call a good pruning measure. There are techniques. You have to leave a branch collar. You don't even know what a branch collar is. You need to learn what is a branch collar. And we'll show you, talk about that in a little bit here. People do topping and lifting and excessive pruning, and it can all impact a tree. Utility companies have had a serious habit of doing that through the years. And then there's transplant shock, newly transplanted trees. You'll notice differences in growth of the size of the foliage. The new growth is much smaller, or when the needles drop on a pine, they're dropping much more excessively, or premature fall color. That's a really good clue. When nothing else is really red and the leaves on that tree are red, it tells us something may be wrong with that tree. And the root system may be inadequate to replace moisture lost from the leaves. Lightning damage, not as common, but it is common nonetheless. You'll typically see that long line running from bottom to top if the tree survives. And that's a good indication that the tree has gotten a microburst and suddenly got fried. All of its cells were just suddenly boiled. If they survive, they are often in decline for many years thereafter. And in some parts of the country where hail is really a common problem, you'll actually see what look like actual cankers on the tops of the branches of young shrubs and trees because the hail does so much damage to them. This is where looking at these things can help you to figure out whether you can or cannot solve a customer's problems with your program. Some more stuff. Mechanical injury, the crushing of roots by large construction vehicles. When the final grade was done on my property, they used a backhoe that was something suitable for large construction sites. Certainly not something that would be final grade work. Mulch volcanoes. Mulch can be good, but mulch volcanoes, significant problem. I see this all the time. I've actually seen telephone poles mulched like this, so they looked more convenient and more consistent. We'll talk more about why mulch volcanoes are a bad thing, but if you see these kinds of things, this is a clear indicator of why the tree may be declining. The planting location, putting the wrong plant at the wrong place. The bottom left-hand picture is a blue Atlas cedar placed right next to a house, these trees grow to be 60 feet tall. Some plants don't do well in the sun. Many of the plants that flower and are prettiest for us are understory trees like white birch and dogwood and redbud. They're not meant to be out in the middle of the yard where we can enjoy them. Or we'll put plants that really prefer moisture in very dry spots and wonder why they don't survive. And then, of course, there's nutritional deficiencies, poor color, poor growth. They have lower resistance to pests. They're mycorrhiza, which are associated with many of the root systems of our trees. They don't function well because they're in the wrong soil, acid or alkaline. Often it's most visible when you've got a micronutrient deficiency on maples, oaks, camphor, birch, and it's visible by chlorotic, stunted, yellow leaves. A few more things here. Animal damage. Don't ignore this, especially after a winter where you've got a fair snow level. These animals get very hungry. So you've got any number of possibilities. You've got rodent damage, which is visible on the top two pictures in the right-hand side. If you dug down, you'd find all the bark missing from that juniper, as an example. You've got standing water issues. You've got mixed soil issues. On the left-hand side, you can see the zones of typical typical soils, A, B, and C horizons. But in many new properties, they will mix these things and lay them back down. You've got very infertile soil and very compacted soil mixed in with the good soil that was growing and developing and evolving over time for a long period of time. So you need to look at all of those things. Compacted soils like the picture in the center, where all the roots are staying very close to the surface and they can't go any deeper, a good indication of what's going on. And of course, standing water as well as a continual problem for trees that are not meant to be in standing water. So then there are problems that aren't really problems. And you're going to run into these, I absolutely guarantee it. In fact, I would bet you someone's already asked you what's wrong with my tree about any number of these things in years past. Slime mold. Slime mold is something that grows on the mulch. It's sulfurous yellow at first. It actually has the ability to move, which is fascinating. Over time, it turns brown like the photo on the right top. And then when you touch it, a bunch of powdery spores come out. It does not hurt plants. It may get near them, but it does not damage them. It's feeding on the dead bark mulch. You've got lichens in the center. These are two different examples of lichens. Lichens are plants. They're not parasites. And they live, and they're in combination of a combination of a fungus and also an algae, and they work together to create a place to live and to produce energy for themselves. In fact, here's a nice tidbit of news. In cities prior to the 1970s, you never saw a lichen on a tree. Because we've been able to clean our air up, these lichens are now growing in cities and in places where they never grew before. They're very sensitive to air pollution. So seeing those is a good indication that you've got a healthy plant. Conifer needle casts. Again, old needles on conifers fall off in the fall. It's towards the center of the tree. The heavier the fall off, the better the indication of stress, but it's normal for needles to fall off in the fall in the center of the tree. If they're falling off at the ends of the tree, that's a problem. Then there are predatory insects. Again, don't assume that every insect you see is hurting a tree. And lastly, exfoliating bark. Many trees are planted for the bark that exfoliates. It makes it a desirable tree. Anything from a sycamore to this particular case being a eucalyptus, Coosa dogwoods, stewardias, even hickories. What you want to make sure is that there are no nonlinear cracks, that there's no obvious cracking, no frass or sawdust, no small exit holes. That'll eliminate the likelihood that something's seriously going on. It just may be natural for that tree species. So what do you do about those abiotic conditions that you experience? Well, anything that reduces the vigor of trees will actually increase the risk that some insect or disease is likely to attack it. Sort of makes sense. Some cultural factors can't be fixed, and some can. And trying to sort that out is important. Grade change. So what can we do about grade change? Well, this is a tough one because preventing it is the best solution. If you discover a grade change early enough, you may be able to have the customer or the contractor that does the planting remove the excess soil before it gets too late. If it happens too far after the fact that you discover this, the tree roots are already going to be in decline and it's going to be a real challenge for you to save that plant. We see that a lot in new construction sites where the grade change is constant, either soil scraped away or soil added to. And this is why trees that are on new construction sites often decline up to a decade later, and no one seems to understand why. It's because the way the construction was done on that site. Girdling roots. So oftentimes you don't see it until the damage is done, but if you can see it and you can stop it, you can actually cut the girdling root and stop the girdling, and you may be able to save the tree. This is, again, a strategic, necessary move as a last resort to prevent the tree from dying. I mentioned construction damage already, so I'll leave that as it is, but I will mention that one of the things that many cities now require is that there be a wide berth from and around the construction area to prevent roots from being crushed, but also to prevent equipment from scuffing the bark. Sometimes they'll require you to protect the tree. All of that helps to assure that the customer actually has a tree worth seeing or living with for years after they've moved into a new house. So excess or little water. Well, little water is probably easier to solve than excess water. Excess water on compacted sites and poor drainage areas. Sometimes when you put in a new subdivision, you change the way the water naturally moved through that area. And all of a sudden you've got this massive amount of water going into a property that was not prepared for it, and all of the plants start to decline. If you'll notice that picture on the left-hand side, those are not bark or mulch piles on those trees. Those are actually mounds, trees planted into mounds, because this site had a problem with excessive moisture in the soil. And so they mounded all of these, so they're actually sitting above the natural soil level, and that can help solve the problem. Again, last thing I'll mention in that area is that there's a device. There are two types. One is called air spading. One are called air knives. They break up compaction, and many landscape contractors will have the availability of one or more of those. And lastly, turf and tree irrigation should not be on the same system. They should be on different zones. They require different types of watering, and many times your homeowners may not realize that they can't water trees the way they water grass and expect a good outcome. Okay, so what else? We talked about this whole issue of tree pruning. Pruning has some positives. It can limit excessive growth. You can thin out a tree. It can repair storm damage, and it can restore overgrown plants. If you look at this tree at the top left-hand side, right top, you can see this thing called the branch collar. When you're doing a pruning, you need to make sure that the branch collar is left intact. You never remove a branch collar. When you do it properly, the tree will close over that area very nicely. As you can see in the picture on the bottom, those branch close over and the branches decline, but the tree has already closed the area over and it's inside the tree. Often we will see people take the branch collars off, making the tree susceptible to insects and diseases because they won't close over well at all. And they also, by taking too much foliage off, and I've seen this countless times, especially with shrubbery, is they limit the tree's ability to photosynthesize, and you unbalance the tree. You also increase the chances for insects and disease to attack it. I mentioned this clean cutting concept. That's where you remove the branch collar. Older arborists will sometimes do this because they don't have the knowledge and experience. You don't want to do this. You don't want to see this, and you want to advise customers if they've had their trees pruned in this way. Some people will lift trees, and in some drought-stressed areas I've worked in, I've seen people top the tops of trees so severely that they look like telephone poles. All of this makes the tree extremely vulnerable to a number of problems. Chemical injuries, you need to understand what type of chemical was used. I've had people use weed controls that actually turned out to be soil sterilants, and they thought they were killing their dandelions. They killed all of their trees. because the soil sterilants travel in the soil for extended periods of time. So knowing what the problem is will help you. As you can see on this tree on the right, it looks like it was something that was applied to control weeds. I'm a tree on the left, excuse me. But in fact, we don't know that at this point. Has it also affected the trees? It's hard to tell, but we can see the overground runoff after a rainstorm. Root active herbicides are particularly a problem. Pool chlorine, extremely caustic. Leaf active herbicides, which volatilize, typically those results are temporary, but you still have to explain what went wrong to the customer. And then, of course, fertilizer burns desiccates. So understanding how slow release fertilizers or limiting fertilizers around trees to slow release, as Jim will talk about this afternoon, can provide you with a much safer approach to fertility. Natural gas pipe leaks in places with natural gas lines will force oxygen from the soil, killing almost every plant, including the turf, in a given area. And then I'm amazed at how many times people take out paint and solvents and household cleaners and try to use them outside and end up killing something that shouldn't be killed with them. One of the things I also want to warn you about as you start moving into tree care and as well as lawn care is being sure that your spray tanks, your tip and pours, your 4-gallon backpacks, that everything is designated as for tree care or for lawn care, so there's no chance of cross-contamination ever. And of course, excessive water temperatures in hoses are known to burn foliage. So you need to be aware that in the middle of the summer, before you start spraying out of a tank, you recirculate that water that's been sitting in a hose reel. Transplant shock. This tree on the left is a pretty natural example of needle drop in the fall. But as you can see, this tree's got all of its needles bunched up at the ends. This tells me this is a new transplant. It's also small. So I would expect this to be normal on this tree, but if it was excessive, it might mean that the tree's root systems had not established and it had not been adequately watered to begin with. It helps if you start with a healthy looking tree when you're recommending a planting. You remove the wrap, rope, you remove the rope intentionally because many of it is designed to stay in the plant nursery for a long period of time and not decompose. So it's not made of burlap anymore. It's actually a nylon material and it'll actually strangle and girdle the tree over time. And assure that there's adequate water. We'll talk about in a later session the use of hydrotane, which is what you use in your hydrocarbon program, and how that can help you with trees and their root systems and allowing for moisture to flow properly. We'll also talk about NutriRoot as well, so you'll have a good sense of what's going on there. Staking. This is another important factor where we have problems. Use stakes that are approved. In the old days, people would take a garden hose and put a wire through it, and inevitably those things become embedded in trees, or ropes become embedded in trees. You just need to be looking for those kinds of things and giving people guidance before it's too late. Mulching, 2 to 3 inches is perfect. Depending upon what part of the country you're in, it may be pine straw, it could be bark mulch, it could be shredded bark mulch. You don't want it deeper and you don't want it thicker because it will start to cause problems for the trees. There is a specific time of year where you want to be sure there's adequate moisture, and especially before the ground freezes in those parts of the country where you have frozen ground, and also during summer heat and drought. So just reminding customers, especially on new plants, that they need to be watering them during times of stress. One other abiotic condition that seems pretty obvious is this issue of chlorotic trees. If you look at that chart on the far right-hand side, you'll notice as the pH goes up, iron, manganese, and boron become unavailable. And typically what we'll see in alkaline soils on trees that are not meant to be grown there is that we'll see these nutrients are deficient and the tree resulting is chlorotic, like you see in the picture on the far left. So it really means that in most cases, the tree's mycorrhiza, which are the fungi that are associated with tree roots, they're simply not happy there. They don't grow well. And if they don't grow well, then the tree roots can't pull in adequate water and nutrients, so the trees struggle. They tie up the key nutrients, they make them unavailable. And then in acid conditions, you can have the same thing happen. If you look on the bottom right-hand side, you'll notice there that we've got a chlorotic oak, but you'll notice it's not nearly as severe as the left. And that's because it's about a balance between manganese and iron. Instead of it being that there's no iron or no manganese, it's about imbalance. And so in oaks, it's much more subtle. I've seen this as far east as the middle of Pennsylvania, where these oaks look like hell. And the reason is that there's an imbalance. So you figure out by doing a soil test, I need something else in the soil. Again, micronutrients are needed in small quantities, but they're critical to the survival of the tree, and their unavailability will limit the tree's health. We talked about mulch volcanoes. This is one of the best pictures I've ever seen of mulch volcano. It can be good. It has positives, inhibits weed competition, prevents damage from weed whackers and mowers. It helps hold moisture in the critical root zone. All those positives, but negatives. It dries quickly in the summer, and if there's too much mulch, the roots, as you can see here, grow up into the mulch, and when that dries, those roots die. Bark is also not supposed to be continually wet, and when the bark is always wet, it encourages diseases to enter. It also prevents the correct oxygen levels in roots. We talked about this a bit earlier, but without them, a mature tree with as much as 6 inches of additional soil can die, and often does. And of course, too much mulch will limit water penetration when you're not getting a significant amount of water during the summer months. So if it's not a cultural problem, we talked about the fact that the majority of problems are not insects and diseases. But when you start looking at insects and diseases, then you've got all of these possibilities. What could it be? And it intimidates most people. And I understand that because it intimidated me when I first started doing this. But just like with cultural challenges, a bit of detective work can narrow the possibilities of what's happening. So as we look at things here, knowing the tree species, as I mentioned earlier, is going to significantly narrow down the likelihood of what is taking place. And it'll help you in identifying what insect or disease might be attacking that tree, because many pests are very specific to tree species. You can use your state extension sites, search engines, universities. Get a pair of binoculars to help you with tall trees. Over the next couple of days, we're going to address some of the top key pests in the areas that we feel are most important for you to know about. But these are the things that can help you to figure out what it could be. This happens to be a Joshua tree growing in Arizona. It's perfectly content and very happy. That's the way it's supposed to grow. You'd need to know that if you were in Arizona, not to worry that it didn't have enough leaves on it. When we do a disease diagnosis, they sort of fall into two groups, fungi and bacteria. With bacteria, we can only suppress. Typically, we get a year of suppression with treatments. Funguses may be cured, prevented, or suppressed depending on the type. And so you have to assess them. Are they going to hurt the tree? Is it more of a surface issue? Can it kill the tree, or is this just unsightly? Leaf diseases such as leaf spots are often just minor, and they're usually well tolerated. And so a thing like a tar spot, it looks horrible on a maple tree, but it doesn't do any harm to the tree. This apple scab on the top left creates a spot, but eventually it causes the leaves to fall off, much more of a serious concern. Some diseases will kill the leaves, defoliate trees. In all those cases, it's causing a weakening of the tree and a stunting of the growth. Some of the more serious ones are this one on the bottom left, this thing called armillaria root rot. It can kill a tree. Knowing the difference is important to you. Others move from flowers to leaves to twigs. And the most difficult ones, the ones that you really don't often have a solution for, are those that cause trunk rots and wood decay, where you'll see mushrooms coming out of the bottom of the tree. These are often things that are untreatable in today's world. And many of the most difficult problems that we face are actually caused by this thing called an insect vector disease, which means the insect brings the disease to the tree. So if the insect doesn't kill the tree, the disease does. Sometimes they contain multiple fungi. The fungus is often the food source for the insect, so it brings its own food. It's kind of like you bringing a box lunch to work with you. And it blocks up the tree's vascular tissue, And oftentimes it can kill the tree even if you're able to stop the pest. And that's why most of the solutions for those kinds of insects require us to use an insect control and a disease control. And we'll talk about those over the next couple of days. And again, they require a two-pronged approach, insect and disease control. One of the books that I've read to help me with the disease fungi that I cannot control, the wood decay fungi, is this one by Christopher Lully. I'd recommend you pick it up. I think either the Tree Care Industry Association or the ISA offer these books. You can catch them on their websites. Lots of good visuals, which I really like, to help you understand what's going on with these serious problems that we can't solve. So again, narrowing the diagnosis. Start by examining the crown at the soil interface of the tree. Search for the trunk flare. Does the trunk actually go straight into the ground, or does it flare out at the bottom? It's supposed to do some flaring. Are there bark wounds? Is there sawdust? Are there holes? Obvious fungal growths, conchs, or large fruiting bodies? We're starting at the bottom. Then we go to the lower branches. Are there galls on the branches? Are there leaves that are being chewed or laced? Or is there any sooty mold growing or honeydew on the leaves? Are the leaves off color? Are they missing? Are they larger or smaller than they should be? Spots, discolorations, concentric circles. So you strategically and systematically go through looking at each part of the plant that you can see. Do you know what the tree species is? We talked about that earlier. Can you look at the branch growth habit over the last few days, last few years? Like we talked about those internodal growths. Is it consistent or getting shorter, or is it looking fine? Examine the lower branches. Use binoculars if necessary. Is the bark darkened? Darkened bark can indicate sooty mold, which means it's growing on the honeydew from insects that suck and pierce the tree, such as you see on the dogwood in this picture. The top left is a horned oak gall caused by a wasp that distorts the tree. This has been a real problem in the Kansas area recently, and we have solutions to help with those. Whereas the tar spot on the left, on the maple, looks incredibly serious, but it's an aesthetic problem. It doesn't ever really hurt the tree. Again, examine the leaves. Are they normal? Are they laced? Are they missing? This allows you to compare a number of possibilities and narrow down what's going on. So to summarize this section, sometimes it's really easy. You get lucky. You find the pest. You can see it chewing on the tree. You know what you need to do. Sometimes you need to unravel the puzzle first. If you use this deliberate approach that I've described for you, it's going to prevent incorrect diagnosis, and it's going to help even an inexperienced plant health care professional learn what they need to know to make an adequate diagnosis and to recommend a good solution. It's also going to allow you to narrow your focus and expose other possibilities. I always visit the entire landscape when I'm called out to look at a pest problem or a tree problem and find other things that I can add value for that customer, such as I see that you've got a lot of roses. Would you like me to show you a way to increase the number of roses you get on those by showing you a pruning technique? And I'll show them how to go back to five leaflet leaves, and they'll be they'll be happy, they'll be pleased. It's all that extra value you all will add. If you find an insect adult, a larval stage, pupa or eggs, it makes the idea a lot easier. Even if you don't recognize what it is at first, take a picture of it. You can later confirm it on sites, any number of them, including the ArborJet app, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But bugwood.org is an excellent site for all of the major insects that we face in this country. Only after you've gone through all that can you make a good recommendation. And when I say gone through all of that, that could be 10 minutes. It may be all the time it takes you on a property to do that once you're comfortable with it.